We now come to the motions relating to the United Kingdom's withdrawal from and future relationship with the European Union. I inform the House that I have selected the following motions for decision by recorded vote. Motion C, in the name of Mr. Kenneth Clarke. Motion D, in the name of Mr. Nicholas Bowles. Motion E, in the name of Mr. Peter Kyle. And motion G, in the name of Joanna Cherry. Shortly, I shall call a moment, any moment now. Yes, very well, I'll happily take a point of order. Yes, point of order, Mr. Greg Hands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps you could clarify why it is that we've just selected a motion for debate, in this case letter C, in the name of my Right Honourable Friend, the member for Rashly, when exactly the same motion, with exactly the same words, was debated and rejected by this House only 3 sitting days ago. Perhaps you could explain, for the benefit of those watching, why it is that this can be brought back 3 days later, but the 585-page withdrawal agreement cannot.
The short answer to the Right Honourable Gentleman is that the House has agreed to the process which has unfolded, and therefore it is entirely procedurally proper for the judgment that I have made to be made. That is the judgment that I have made. And the Right Honourable Gentleman will have noted the view that was expressed in the debates last week. And let me say, in terms that are very clear, the Right Honourable Gentleman might not approve of them, but they're clear, that the purpose of this discrete exercise, as understood, I think, by colleagues across the House, is to try to identify whether there is a potential consensus among members for an approach to departure from and future relationship with the European Union. It is in that spirit, and in the knowledge that it is wholly impossible, colleagues, to satisfy everybody, that I have sought conscientiously to discharge my obligations to the House by making a judicious selection. That is what I've done. That I readily defend to the House. That I will continue to proclaim to be the right and prudent course in circumstances which were not of my choosing, but with which, as Chair, I am confronted. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Mr. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know I to be one not to play games in this place. And with respect, could I just ask you to reconsider when it comes to motions A and B? And the reason I ask and request, we live in unusual times, so I don't apologise for making this request. But motion A is new in the sense that it reflects the withdrawal agreement as amended by the backstop, and I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that it is the one vote we've had in this place on the back of the Brady amendment that actually achieved a majority. So it's a new motion that has previously achieved a majority, and I think it worthy, with respect, and I mean that, for consideration. And might I also suggest, Mr. Speaker, if only for future reference, that motion B actually is the legal default position from us triggering Article 50. And I do think it is incumbent on us to consider that when, in this particular debate, when we're trying to find some sort of consensus.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order and for the very reasonable tones in which, as usual, he expresses it. He and I have known each other a long time, and I have the highest regard for the integrity of the honourable gentleman. I'm very happy, though I'm not obliged to provide an answer to each of his 2 points. I say I'm not obliged, not in my interests, but because the House has long understood and asserted the obligation of the Chair to make these judgments, and expected that the Chair would not provide an explanation, but that the House having vested in the chair the responsibility, would accept the judgment. However, I am very happy in this case to respond to his 2 points. First, in relation to his motion appertaining to the backstop, he makes his own point in his own way. I have to make a judgment about what I think is reasonable in terms of going forward. And in this debate, colleagues, we are not acting alone. We are acting in a negotiation with the European Union. And the point that the honourable gentleman feels strongly about is expressed in this motion for the first time, but it has been aired repeatedly. I don't say that critically, but as a matter of fact, since the publication in November of the withdrawal agreement. And repeated commitments have been made to seek a re-examination of that point by the Union, and it has become very clear over a period of months that that re-examination is not offered by the Union. Now, it may or may not feature in the future, but in terms of trying to broker progress now, I did not think it would be the most sensible motion to choose at this time. I put it no more strongly than that. Secondly, in relation to the so-called no-deal motion, and if the honourable gentleman will forgive me, and frankly, even if he won't, I am going to replay to him his own point in my support rather than his. The honourable gentleman, somewhat exasperated that I haven't selected his motion, well, quizzical, let's say, says, but Mr. Speaker, leaving without a deal on the 12th of April is the legal default. The honourable gentleman is exactly right. It is precisely because it is the default position in law that having it on the paper, in my view, is a rhetorical assertion, but it is a statement of fact, and it doesn't, in my judgment, require debate. That's the first point. And the second point in relation to that self-same motion is that in looking at it, the honourable gentleman from Torbay can chunt from a sedentary position in evident disapproval of the thrust of the argument that I'm developing if he so wishes. But it doesn't detract from the fact that I'm making the point I'm making. He doesn't like it, I do, and we'll have to leave it there. The simple fact of the matter is that that motion, voted upon last week, as the honourable gentleman's PDI testifies he realises, was rejected by 400 votes to 160. A significant number of members of the House did not vote, but even if every member of the House who did not vote on that motion last week were to vote in favour of it this week, it still wouldn't pass. And I see my duty as being to try to advance matters. Whatever people think about this issue, whatever side of the argument they sit, they feel, can we not make some progress? And it is in pursuit of progress that I have made the disinterested, I use that old-fashioned but valid term, the disinterested judgment that I have made to try to serve the House. I totally understand that it won't please everybody, but it happens to be my view, and it's an honest one, and it's my best judgment. Yes, very well. I mean, I do say to colleagues, I'll happily take points of order indefinitely, and I've got good knee muscles and plenty of energy. I'm not sure it will greatly advance matters, but if the honourable gentleman wants to raise a point of order, he's most welcome to do so. Point of order, Mr. Charlie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have always found you very patient in hearing the concerns of any colleague in this House, and always very passionate about the rulings that you make. The other day, you made a ruling in relation to, if I may remind you, Meaningful Vote 3, and you said you wanted to make it clear that you did expect the test of change to be met. They should not seek to circumvent my ruling by means of tabling either a notwithstanding motion or a paving motion. The table office has been instructed that no such motion shall be accepted. What, then, is 1C, which seems to be exactly that, sir?
I'm awfully sorry, because I thought I had... forgive me if I wasn't sufficiently clear. I thought I had been. My apologies to the honourable gentleman if my reply was too opaque. But I thought I indicated an earlier reply that the House, in the motion that it had supported, had endorsed the approach to indicative votes which we are now taking. It is a discrete process. It is separate from and different to the processes that have been adopted thus far. And all sorts of arguments and explanations have been given as to why we're in this process, with the House taking control of the process, and I don't need to revisit those. but I have answered that point already. I don't wish to be unkind to the honourable gentleman, whom I like and respect very much, as he knows, but I fear I have to say to him, it's not that I haven't answered his point. I have answered his point already in response to an earlier point of order, but the simple fact is the honourable gentleman doesn't like my answer, and I'm afraid I can't do anything about that. Point of order, Mrs Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And obviously we have got the confirmatory public vote, which we are going to be debating tonight. But this House voted on a confirmatory public vote, and I believe only gathered 85 votes at the time. I'm just wondering, Mr Speaker, why that vote, which was so roundly rejected by this House, it wasn't even supported by the benches opposite. I'm just wondering, Mr Speaker, why this is worthy of having another debate today. Perhaps it should be kicked out.
I hope the honourable lady will forgive me. I may have misheard her, but I thought she said something about 85 votes. I thought she did, but from memory, I don't have it in front of me, although I can easily find it. It won't be very difficult. I think I'm right in saying that the vote for the confirmatory public vote, the vote for a confirmatory referendum, received 268 votes and was defeated. Well, the honourable lady is shaking her head, but I'm trying to answer the point. I think it received 268 votes and was opposed by 295, so it was defeated. But again, if the honourable lady will forgive me, and even if she won't, I repeat the point that this is part of a process for which the House voted, and colleagues did so in the knowledge that a result might not be achieved on day one or even necessarily on day two, but the House wanted that process to take place. It may be, I haven't looked at the division lists and it's absolutely her right, it may be that the honourable lady voted against this process altogether, and I completely respect her autonomy in making that judgment, but the House chose to adopt this process, and what I have done and am doing is entirely in keeping with the spirit of that process.
Confirmation.
Is it further to? I'm not sure there is a further to.
It is further. So the 85 I'm referring to was when the honourable member for Totnes brought the vote before the House, not the last vote.
I'm sorry, I didn't realise that was what the honourable lady was saying. OK, but my point about the discrete process that we're undertaking and the level of support for that particular motion stands. And what I have tried to do, and I say this not least so that our proceedings are intelligible to those who are not members of the House but are watching, is to identify those propositions that appear to command substantial support and preferably of a cross-party nature. That is what I have done, and it does seem to me, if I may say so, that although it can't please everybody, it is quite a reasonable approach, as opposed to, for example, identifying a series of propositions which have minimal support and thinking that it will be a frightfully good sport instead to submit them to a verdict of the House again. That wouldn't seem to me a particularly constructive way in which to proceed. So I'm for a constructive approach, and I hope most of the House will agree with me that that is how we should operate.